So a couple of years ago, I made a video teaching you how to make collapsible wooden tree skirts. I received a ton of positive feedback for that build, so I decided to redesign it. And in this video, I'll be teaching you how to make these hexagon collapsible tree skirts. And the great thing about this design, just like the previous version, it can all be popped apart at the end of the year and stored away. And ultimately, like anything else, you can use any material that you would like to build these, but you guessed it, I'm going to be making mine out of fence pickets. So to start out for this build, we need to rip down all of our boards that we're going to be using for our side panels. And you can pretty much use any type of material that you would like for this, even plywood. Ultimately, any material that you have that's 9.5 inches wide, you can use it. So you can use a solid board, you could rip down plywood in the strips, or you can build it the way that I'm going to. And as always, I'm going to be teaching you step by step on how to build this awesome hexagon tree skirt. But if you're a plans in the hand type of person, head over to my website, where I'll throw a link in the description. So at the table saw, the first thing that I'm going to do is to rip my 4 fence pickets down to 4 3/4 of an inch wide. Since I have a little room to play with on these, I'm going to trim up the edge first. That way I have 2 nice finished edges. Alright, so now that we have our boards ripped down to 4 3/4 of an inch, we can go ahead and cut these to size. Just on a side note, I chose to use cedar because I'm not going to be painting this. Plus cedar is kind of Christmassy. But if you do plan on painting this, then you can just use regular pine pickets. It's up to you. So at the miter saw, I'm going to start by trimming my ends. I'm going to be cutting these 4 boards down into 18-inch pieces. And we'll be able to get 3 usable boards out of each full-length board. I know some of you guys are probably thinking, well, these are 72-inch boards, and we're cutting them down into 18-inch sections. Why aren't we getting 4 parts per board? By the time that we trim up our ends and then account for the saw blade curve, which is the thickness of the blade, that's going to leave our last board just a bit short. But make sure to hang on to that board because we'll be using those later. Okay, so now that we have all of our boards cut to size, I'm going to go ahead and just lay these out into pairs. Basically, the reason why I'm doing this is just so I can see how my colors are going to line up. So again, I will not be putting paint on this, so I kind of want the natural colors for each panel to match the best that they can. So now that I have the panels laid out the way that I want, we need to join these. And for that, I'm going to be using pocket hole screws. So before I head over to cut those holes, I'm going to go ahead and mark out each one of these bottom boards because those are going to be the only boards that we're going to be putting pocket holes into. And before you separate any of these, I'll go ahead and label each pair. So now with that done, we can take each one of our bottom boards. I'm going to make a mark at 2.5, 9 inches, and 15.5. This is where I'll cut my pocket holes. Now I'll just repeat this for the rest of my bottom boards. So now that we have our boards all measured out, let's go ahead and grab all of our bottom boards and head over to the 720. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to set my stop collar on my drill bit. And you'll do that depending on what thickness of material that you use. Since fence pickets seem to have gotten thinner and thinner, I'll be setting my bit up for 1/2 inch and using 1-inch pocket hole screws. Here's a little tip just in case you do not have 1-inch pocket hole screws and only have 1.25 inch. If you had to make this work or your material was just a little bit thicker, from the 1/2 inch mark you could drop your collar just a little bit, maybe 1/8 inch, lock it down there, and the 1.5 inch screws will work. This is something you should probably test out on a scrap piece of material, just be on the safe side. I'm just going to cut 3 pocket holes on each one of my boards on each one of my marks. Now as you can see, I'm placing my marks facing up. This will just make it a little quicker for lining up your holes. Now back at the table, I'm just going to pair these back up. So now with our pocket holes cut, let's go ahead and join each one of our panels. And like I said before, I'm going to be using 1-inch pocket hole screws for this. Even though you don't necessarily have to use wood glue whenever you're using pocket hole joinery, I always like to throw a little bit in just to be on the safe side. Of course, if you're using plywood panels or solid boards that are already 9.5 inches wide, you won't be doing any of this. Essentially, you would just cut your boards to length and then pick back up after this step. So now that we have all of our panels assembled, let's get to the fun part. Let's cut some compound miters. So a compound miter is what's going to be giving this hexagon shape the ability to kind of angle in. Typically, if you're cutting hexagons, it's just a series of 30-degree miters. Since we're changing things up by adding this tilt in, that actually changes a lot of things. So to start off with, for making this compound cut, let's go ahead and set our saw. I'm going to start with the angle, and I'm going to put this to as close as 16.1 as I can. So just a hair past the 16 mark. We'll lock that down. And since we've set our angle to the right, I'm going to set my bevel to the left. And that's going to be as close to 25.7 as I can get. You can go ahead and round up or down on all of these settings, and it really won't be noticeable because we're not going to be able to set these saws perfectly anyway. So with our saw set up and ready to make some cuts, first I'm going to get all my panels positioned where the pocket holes or the screw heads will be facing against my fence. Really, either way, you're not going to hit these screws. That was the importance of the 2.5 inch from the sides, but doing it this way is just going to keep everything uniform. So keep in mind whenever you're making these cuts, you want to keep the full length of the bottom of the panel, which will be the side closest to me. So we're just going to position our board so that whenever we make this cut, that the bottom surface is keeping its full 18 inches. So after you've made your first compound cut, we'll simply flip the board over, slide it down, and mirror this cut on the left side of our board. So now the bottom of the panel is facing our fence and our pocket holes are facing down. Once you've made both cuts, your panel should look like this. The side with the pocket hole screws, which will be on the inside of our hexagon, this will be the front of our panel. And then the back of our panel will have the pocket hole screws, and then both of these angles will be tapered in. So with the first one done, let's just repeat this for our remaining 5 boards. So now that we have all of our sides taken care of, we only have one more cut left to make on these panels, and that's going to be on this bottom. We're going to do that at the table saw, and we're going to be adding a 30-degree bevel. The reason why we're doing this is because our hexagon is actually tilted in at a 30-degree angle. If we transfer that angle along the bottom of our board, then all of our panels are going to be sitting flat. So to add this bevel into the bottom, we're simply going to set our saw to 30 degrees. Then we're going to move our fence over to 9 3/16, lock that down, and with our pocket holes facing down and our tops against the fence, we'll run each panel through. So whenever we get done with that, it should look something like this. So all of the angles or bevels that we have cut are all facing in the same direction towards the back. Now let's add some trim to the front and start putting this thing together. Okay, so for our trim, I'm going to be using the same material that we used to make the rest of this, and it's all going to be 1 inch wide. This is where those little leftover pieces are going to come in handy. They're not going to be long enough for some of the trim pieces, but we'll definitely be able to use them. Now, since these won't be long enough for some of the parts, I'm going to go ahead and cut a few extra 1 inch strips on the table saw. So for the bottom trim on this, I'm going to be adding a 30-degree angle. That way that the angle will match whenever we install these onto our panels. So the bottom trim is going to end up being 18 3/4 of an inch long, and I'll be needing 6 of those. So I'm going to take a couple of my longer pieces, set my table saw back to 30 degrees, then add a 30-degree angle to one edge, making sure to leave the full 1 inch face. And you should be able to do this by setting your fence to 13/16. Right, so now that we have some stock ripped down, I'm going to go ahead and start out by cutting all of the bottom trim. Now keep in mind whenever I'm giving you the sizes for all these trim pieces, is you should really custom fit these parts, just in case your panel is off a little bit, or you're using different material than I am. So I'll show you how to cut these and give you the lengths. I would add an extra 1/8 of an inch or so if you're wanting to custom fit each one of these parts. So with our miter saw set up exactly the way that we left it, we're going to start off by cutting our bottom trim with the flat side of the trim against the fence and the 30-degree angle facing out. The 1 inch wide face will be against the bottom of the miter saw. So once we've made this cut, that leaves us with a piece of trim that's 18 3/4 of an inch long from tip to tip. Now we're just going to repeat this 5 more times. So with our bottoms cut, I'm going to go ahead and get those installed. I'm going to lay my panel out so that all of my angles are facing down, and I'm going to take my bottom board and also face that angle down. And if you wanted to test this angle out to make sure that everything is matching, you could just stand your panel up and make sure that both of your 30-degree angles are touching the surface. This would be the point that if you had overhang on any side, go ahead and trim that up. So I'm just going to add some wood glue to the bottom of this, put it back in place, test my angle, and then once everything lines up the way that you want it, you can just lay it back down. And I'm going to be attaching all of this trim using brad nails. So at this point, our bottom will look something like this. So we'll go ahead and repeat this for the rest of our panels and then move on to our other trim pieces. So now that we have all of our bottom boards connected, let's cut our tops, our middle, and our sides. Once we get everything done, it should look something like this, without the brown stain. This was a test piece. So for the rest of these trim cuts, we're no longer going to be needing this bevel. We'll keep our angle at a little over 16 degrees, but we'll set our bevel back to 0. Now for our top boards, this is where some of those smaller pieces may come in handy. We're going to need these at 13 inches long from tip to tip. And then I'll start off by making my first cut. I'll flip the board over just as before, measure down 13 inches and make my second cut. And we'll just repeat this for 5 more tops. And then for our 6 middle boards, we'll just repeat this at 13 3/8. And then we'll cut our 12 side pieces. These are going to be 8.5 inches long. The only difference that we're going to do here is we're not going to flip the board. We'll just make our cut and slide it down. And just keep in mind on these side pieces, even though both end angles are facing the same direction, the measurement will still be from tip to tip, 8.5 inches long. So now that we have all of our trim parts cut, let's go ahead and put all of this together. I'm going to start off by installing my sides. Now the important thing to keep in mind about the sides, we want to line these up with the edge of our panel and make sure that they're flush against our bottom trim. Now if you notice from the top view, it looks like that our bottom trim is a little too long on each side. That's just because it has a beveled bottom. So the main thing that we're looking for is that it's flush along the edge. Okay, so I messed up. Everything that I told you is right, except this side here, I cut one end at the wrong angle. I must have gotten the habit of flipping the board because you notice how this one angles in and this one does not. So I'm just going to pull that off, cut another piece, get back to it. So now with our sides both facing the right direction, let's install our tops. And then finally our center boards. These will be really easy to line up because you'll adjust each side until both of your angles are flush. So whenever we get done with our trim, our panel should look like this. So I'll do the same thing for the remaining 5 panels, and then it'll be time to start installing the hinges. Okay, so we're going to be using a couple of different hinges for this build. We're going to be needing 6 of these standard little pin hinges that are 1.5 inches long, and we'll be using these to connect our 6 panels into pairs. I'll get to the second style of hinge once we get these installed. So we're going to start by matching our bottom angles on our trim and the inside angles on the tops of our panels. And it's kind of awkward trying to hold these into place. So if you have a couple of squeeze clamps, you can help hold these into place using the trim and installing one at the top and the bottom. With your clamps in place, now we can turn this over and work from the inside. I'm going to install my first hinge about 1 inch from the top, and then my second hinge about 1 inch from the bottom. And I figured out with these smaller screws, these things are a lot easier to install if you pre-drill. Now with the hinges installed, I can get rid of these clamps. For the purpose of these hinges, is going to be for storage. So at the end of the year, whenever you're not using this thing, you can simply fold it up and put it away. So now that we have our panels all paired up, let's go ahead and install some lift hinges. These are actually offset lift hinges, or some people call them flag hinges, but you can see that it has a little lift to it here. And the purpose of a lift hinge is so that you can install both sides, but the hinge itself is not locked together. So whenever you'd like to take it apart, you can just lift up and comes apart. So this little hinge is what's going to allow these 3 sections to all come apart to be stored away. So the hinges that I'm going to use may look just a bit different than the ones that I'm going to link, simply because these are pretty expensive and I found a cheaper style. But the installation is going to be the same regardless. So when you first take your hinge out of the box, they may be lined up like this, with the counter bores all facing up. Good thing about a lift hinge is they're easy to change. With the hinge closed, we want one counter bore facing up and one set facing down. So to install our lift hinges, I'm going to start with 2 sections open and upside down, then we'll just line up the 2 edges. And again, to help keep these into place, I'm just going to install a clamp onto the back. Now really, since the only purpose of this hinge is just to hold this together while in use and to be able to break it apart when not in use, now I'm just going to install one of these hinges directly into the middle. Now the hinges that I'm going to link, they're a little bit smaller. So I would install one at the top and one at the bottom. And so we can test this out. I'm going to turn it to where it's right side up, and you should be able to just lift this right section off of the left. And then to put it back together, you can just line up your hinges, slide back into place, and open it up. So now that we know that our lift hinges are going to work the way that we want, let's go ahead and install 2 more, and we're pretty much done. And if you haven't had a chance to check out my new course, Woodworking Kickstart from Novice to Natural, just head over to my website to find out what this is all about. Positive comments from course members are growing daily. We are receiving a ton of great feedback from not only new woodworkers that have never picked up a tool, but also experienced carpenters. And I can guarantee that this is the most detailed and comprehensive woodworking course on the market. And I hope to see you on the inside. All right, so now that we have all of our hinges in place, let's see what she looks like. Then again, whenever we're done using this, we want to store it away. We just put a little pressure up on the corners with our hinges. And just like that, that huge tree skirt is now right here. So again, this build just shows you that with a bit of patience and creativity, you can pretty much make anything that you can dream up. Till next time, we'll see you.